Now, this is where things get very interesting, because while things line up very well with the impact hypothesis, there's also evidence that in the last 1,000 years leading up to this event, we also see a sudden shift in sea levels caused by something called meltwater pulses, where sea levels could rise up to 25 meters over the course of about 400 years. This long, slow, and gradual event would have definitely brought people more inland for sure, but it would have taken some time to happen. The key difference here is that with the Younger Dryas ice sheet, we are seeing a sudden drop of temperatures in a very short amount of time in contrast. Seriously, today we are worried about a climate change of only a few degrees, but based on data from the Greenland ice sheet, the Younger Dryas period dropped about 4 to 10 degrees Celsius in the space of a few decades. There are alternative theories. However, the presence of the nanodiamonds and impact sites really seem to indicate that the comet is the most likely outcome. Other theories include ideas such as the Earth being hit by a solar flare, causing the ice sheets to begin melting, which still disrupted the ocean currents and subsequently caused the temperatures to drop as a result. And along with this, there's another theory that suggests mega meltwater avalanches that could be generated on the surface of a continental ice sheet and produce fast moving waves of water nearly 100 meters high, traveling at 900 kilometers an hour, crashing into the world and destroying everything in its path. Again, these are all theories, so make sure you do your own research if you really want to go down that rabbit hole. Ultimately, all of these ideas, along with all of the data that we have from the Younger Dryas period, suggests that there was massive flooding and definitely would have been experienced by humans living at that time as catastrophic. Now, since research into all of this is still ongoing, there are still many mysteries to be revealed about this event. Naturally, with sea levels rising, the lower coastal lands are the first to be submerged, and anyone living and hunting there would have been submerged with it, similar to how Doggerland was submerged around 6,200 BC in Europe. Any humans who survived such cataclysmic events would have had it ingrained in their cultural memory that would have been passed through oral tradition into later civilizations. If this event really happened, it most certainly would have contributed to the mass extinction events that we see in history, and in extent paved the way for the host of flood myths on every continent. And the last thing I'd like to speak on concerning the Younger Dryas impact is this. Generally speaking, the Younger Dryas impact is believed to have taken place about 12,800 years ago, which, returning to this chart, shows us when we see this sudden and sharp drop in global climate. However, there's very little conversation about what this other spike is, known geologically as the Bowling-Allerod period, which takes place just before. It's true that when we look at the last 1,000 years before the Younger Dryas, we see phenomenal climate changes as well, but there is very little evidence about what caused it. And most theories about how this could have been caused are problematic or inconclusive. The standing theory at the moment is that warm ocean currents deep in the North Atlantic abruptly released into the colder water above it, warming the waters and causing ice sheets to break off from the glaciers. While this is the prevalent theory, many others simply remark that it's just climate change, which seems to be another way of saying, well, we don't quite know for sure. Yet, if this is just a result of natural climate cycles, then that certainly brings about a much different perspective on climate change today. So that said, we have a few ideas about this on our own, because to us, this looks like a connected event. It looks like the Earth may have been going through some natural warming on its own, but that something caused temperatures to spike up and then suddenly drop. This may indicate that the comet impact is a little bit older than believed, that the first spike was actually the comet impact, and then the drop was the result of enough meltwater flooding the oceans for so long that it disrupted the ocean currents, and we see the temperatures go down as we discussed. Another possibility is that the first spike was the solar flare that we explored previously, which may have triggered a radical lifting of the Earth's temperatures, causing the ice to melt, flooding the oceans and disrupting the currents. If this is true, then perhaps a comet is not necessary in the equation. However, it's worth mentioning that the nanodiamonds seem to indicate that there was a comet in Earth's recent history. It's possible that there are other causes of such a spike too. If we look to ancient India, we find stories of the Astra or the Brahmastra superweapons. However, before we can explore and discuss these superweapons or where they fit into our ancient past, we must return to the subject of Göbekli Tepe. This site is compelling archaeological evidence that now dates human civilization back to nearly 12,000 years ago, around roughly 9,000 BCE. What puzzles archaeologists and historians alike was the previous assumption that stratified and complex civilizations did not emerge until around the time of Sumer, about 7,000 years ago. Until then, all we have evidence of in the timeline are semi-nomadic pastoralists who would follow hunted game around seasonally, perhaps occasionally using tools. instances of monumental architecture are extremely rare, even though we have cases such as Cahokia in the Mississippi River Valley and a supposed city of hunter-gatherers. The general consensus is a distinct lack of the social organization required to build and maintain complex ritual sites. Even more interestingly, the timeline arguably lines up with a certain theory about the date of the construction of the Sphinx in ancient Egypt. Robert Schoch is responsible for identifying what he believes are wear patterns on the Sphinx that he has labeled as water erosion. But there were no great storms in ancient Egypt 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But if you go back 12,000 years ago, there was heavy rainfall in that region, where in the Holocene, the region was much greener and wetter than it is now. Now, the Sphinx erosion theory was met with great skepticism. Dr. Zahi Hawass, head of the Egyptian Board of Antiquities, said at the time, "Of course it is not possible for one reason. No single artifact, no single inscription or pottery or anything has been found until now in any place to predate the Egyptian civilization more than 5,000 years ago." This was a common belief back then, since the earliest signs of megalithic construction were only 5,000 years old. But the discovery and dating of Göbekli Tepe proves that structures were being built around 12,000 years ago in one form or another. While a lot of work has been done to try and disprove the Sphinx water theory, such as limestone analysis and contextual orientation, what if there really was something even more ancient about the Sphinx? The Sphinx has fascinated people since Cleopatra's times. There are inscriptions from as far back as Ptolemaic Egypt of excavations unearthing the Sphinx in the search for hidden passages. And even today, the mystery of the Sphinx persists. We have no idea what it is, what it's for, and there is nothing we have found that's like the Sphinx at Giza. Who built it? Why? How? Mainstream academics believe it was built in the time of Khafre, based on the likeness of the head and similarity of the temple of the Sphinx, but other anomalies persist. The most basic mystery regarding the Sphinx is how it's missing from the Egyptian records. Egyptians loved to write hieroglyphs. We have writings talking about the purchasing of materials and construction of pyramids, divorce records. There's even a record about how one day there was a woman disgruntled by a piece of bread who tried to fight the traitor. Seriously, meticulous records, including records for all of the temples. Yet no records exist from ancient Egypt about the building of the Sphinx. They just don't exist, not a single word about it in the written records. One thing we do know from an inscription on the ancient Egyptian artifact, the Dream Speller, is that the pharaoh Khafre, who today many believe built the Sphinx, claims that he himself discovered the Sphinx buried in the sand and had his temple built around it. Not only that, but the Sphinx also lines up with the sun for the spring equinox, and the constellation housing the sun circa 5,000 years ago is Taurus. But 9,000 BC, or 11,000 years ago, we see Leo in the sky, which may be another clue as to when the Sphinx was actually built. Despite the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, Robert Schoch's erosion hypothesis, and the constellation alignment, not to mention with the Sphinx's construction missing from the records, many modern scientists remain skeptical and critical of these arguments. While we will admit, if it was just one anomaly, maybe it would seem like a pretty crazy idea. But when you put all of the anomalies together, they do seem to add up. All of the evidence we have explored was known about before Göbekli Tepe was discovered. But most scientists argued that it was preposterous since no other megalithic sites were made this far back. But thanks to the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, the idea that the Sphinx is older than we thought is starting to be thought about more often. The construction of Göbekli Tepe would then be attributed to survivors of the catastrophe who passed on their advanced knowledge to human tribes set back from the massive natural disaster. This is especially made curious by the legendary carvings of the handbags of the gods. You see, all over the world, we find these images of gods holding what looks like a bag. And there is a carving from Göbekli Tepe featured on Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Pillar, dating nearly to 9,000 BCE, which shows a similar handbag-like image. It has left many to ponder their connection, and some even believe that the handbag is a sign of the gods bestowing the seeds of knowledge of civilization to humanity. What's more amazing is that Göbekli Tepe is located at the south of Turkey, inside of the Fertile Crescent, the place where agriculture is believed to have been invented 10,000 years ago. Could those handbags be a clue to bridging the gap between a lost civilization and the world we have today? Göbekli Tepe raises a lot of questions to the established history and archaeology of the time. The Great Extinction, evidence of flooding, great climate change, and structures way ahead of their time all seem to be pointing to a single earth-shaking event around 12,000 years ago. And its time of origin lines up with many significant events and mysteries present in our timeline so far. For many scholars, the uncovering of this 12,000-year-old structure corroborated theories and hypotheses that were once considered fringe or conspiratorial. Now, when we're looking at the story of our ancient past and the stories of old, there's one more area that must be explored, and it must be done with caution: the Hindu scriptures. Now, the most famous in New Age circles is the Bhagavad Gita, which is a huge topic all on its own. It's over 700 verses long and is just a small part of the enormous Mahabharata epic. It's actually only part of book 6 of the epic, which has over 18 books, yet is an aspect of this particular conversation about ancient civilizations that a lot of people talk about today. The Bhagavad Gita is set in the frame of a conversation between one of the Pandava princes, a guy named Arjuna, and his guide, the god Krishna. As it opens, it covers something known as the Dharma Yuddha, which translates roughly as the righteous war from Sanskrit. The story begins with Arjuna, who is afraid of what the coming war will do to his people, and afraid of how much suffering it will cause. He wonders if he should renounce and seeks Krishna's counsel, who shows up and says, "Don't worry, kid, you're the best around," and then whose discourse constitutes the majority of the story. The conversations cover a broad range of spiritual topics, touching upon ethical dilemmas and philosophical issues that go far beyond the war Arjuna faces and into profound spiritual teachings. Krishna is basically described as the first motivational speaker in human history. From scholarly points of view, the nature and meaning of the text has been strongly debated, with most researchers and translators arguing that it constitutes allegory or metaphorical tales to illustrate philosophical concepts. Some scholars have also argued that it portrays varying relations between the personal soul, the Atman, and the universal soul, Brahman, and the Advaita Vedanta school arguing that the core tenet is speaking to non-dualism, that all souls are part of the same whole. Alternatively, some schools see dualism as the primary lesson, or that the souls of all of the characters are both different and the same all in one. So if you haven't guessed, academic study of this text is very complex, and there's quite a lot of debate and confusion around the true meaning of the text. For the most part, the setting of the Gita in a battlefield has been interpreted as an allegory for the ethical and moral struggles of human life. However, there are some who believe that the story itself is actually describing an actual account of a real-life war in history, and of course, real-life weapons. This view of the Mahabharata as a literal event is something purported by many ancient astronaut theorists, and as we personally dove into the subject, we found it to be a little bit sketchy. There were a lot of claims, such as ancient nuclear weapon radiation and other quotes from the Gita supporting the theory that then didn't actually exist. The whole thing is likely just a consequence of really bad translations, misunderstandings of the original text, and maybe even a little bit of deception for the sake of content creation. So for anyone who wants to get the full story on the claims about this, we'll share a special blog post in the comments below all about it. However, there are a few aspects of this which is interesting to explore due to mythological similarities to the stories we've been exploring so far. It's just important to know that there doesn't appear to be much in the way of historical or physical evidence for these events. One of the most curious aspects of the Hindu mythologies was the Brahmastra created by the god Brahma, which is described as an iron bolt through which all the individuals in the race of the Vrishnis and the Andakas became consumed into ashes, a fierce iron bolt that looked like a gigantic messenger of death. Interestingly, once King Ugrasena witnessed what the weapon could do, he took the decision to reduce it to a fine powder to protect the future generations to avoid temptation. I don't know about you, but this almost sounds like a description of the thunderbolts theory, of the massive column of lightning that descended from one planet and crashed down to the earth. The only main difference here is that the story seems to indicate it was a purposeful weapon and not a discharge from a planet. The other synchronicity from the Hindu texts includes the presence of something called vimanas, which are said to be flying palaces or chariots that are very common in a number of stories. The mythology here raises interesting questions due to its similarities to other tales from around the world. Could the stories of the Anunnaki and their ships be related in some way to the flying chariots of the Hindu gods? It's not actually as crazy as it sounds that early Indus River Valley civilization and Mesopotamia had cultural links. Stretching as far back as 9,000 to 6,500 BC, indirect contact seems to have occurred as the consequence of the Neolithic Revolution and the spread of agriculture after 9,000 BCE. The prehistoric agriculture of South Asia is thought to have combined local resources like cattle with farming resources from the Near East as a first step around 8000 BCE. At the site of Mehrgarh in Pakistan around 7000 BCE, full sets of Near Eastern agricultural products can be found, stuff like wheat and barley, as well as goats, sheep, and cattle. Later on, trade kind of exploded between the two regions, with stuff like clove heads from the Moluccas being found at Tel Ashara, different kinds of shells and beads being found at various sites around 2500 BCE, and of course, lavishly decorated cylinder seals depicting mythological scenes or animals. The bottom line is, with trade happening pretty consistently until the Indus civilization collapsed, it's almost common sense to acknowledge that cultural ideas and mythologies also got exchanged. In this, even the real mythologies themselves are fascinating and have tons of curious connections throughout without needing to elaborate on them. If there's any grain of truth to these stories at all, then it adds credence to the idea that at one point, perhaps there were advanced civilizations with incredible technologies in our ancient past. Now, looking at our story regarding the fall of Atlantis and the influence of these other beings in the Mesopotamian accounts, it appears that countless cultures have been influenced by these Near Eastern schools of thought, from the Persians to the Greeks. And even much later, it appears as though the Judeo-Christian religions all seem to stem from each other like branches of a tree. But what about the people across the rest of the world? In this historical theory, it suggests that there were still civilizations existing elsewhere on the earth at the time of the fall, because when the inhabitants of Mu left their home, not all of them went to Atlantis. Some moved to the continents we call the Americas, and others went to Asia. This would make sense considering Mu would have been directly between those two in the Pacific Ocean. With this idea, we see this theory begin to explain how different spiritualities developed in different regions of the world. The Lemurians who did not migrate to Atlantis would not have had the same experiences that the Atlanteans did with the fall. And if the stories are true, neither would they have become more left-brain thinkers. And so after the fall, their spiritualities would have developed based on their environments and any supportive influence from those who made it through with their memories intact. When we observe the world's religions today, there are really three main forms that we can identify. Firstly, we have the Western faiths, which are generally the Abrahamic ones, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but which relate with the Greek, Persian, and Egyptian mystery schools from thousands of years prior. Next, we have the Eastern spiritualities like Taoism, Buddhism, Shinto, and so on, which are more to do with connecting with the spirit of nature or going deep within yourself to cultivate inner peace and stillness. Generally, these paths are less seen as religions, but ways of life and traditions to create harmony in one's life. The last faith group are the indigenous spiritualities, which are usually shamanic and animistic in nature, and are often developed around connecting with the spirit of the planet and nature in an intimate relationship to aid in spiritual, emotional, and even physical healing. Now, we understand that there is an incredibly massive number of spiritualities on this planet, and I'm not trying to oversimplify or generalize the diversity here. For so many of these faiths are unique unto themselves and beautiful in what they are and represent. Nevertheless, we can see this pattern of location and influence across time in how these different faith groups emerged, bringing us to where we are today. It would make sense that the Sumerian mythologies and subsequent Abrahamic faiths are concerned with the stories of the gods from the past so much, especially if there were enlightened beings who provided them with these stories in the first place. However, one of the earliest groups to suggest this independent racist theory were the Theosophist Society of Madame Helena Blavatsky in the late 1800s. In her work, The Secret Doctrine, she proposes a theory that 5 to 6 different root races spread out across the globe and settled in different regions as the earth changed throughout history. Of course, much of their information was apparently gleaned through astral clairvoyance and channeling, as well as discussing the older works of the Platonic philosophers. So take what is said here on your own merit. According to Blavatsky's writings, there will be 7 root races assembled for our earth, and each root race is divided into 7 sub-races, but only 5 root races have appeared so far, with the 6th being expected to emerge in the 28th century. Francis Bacon, whom Theosophy considers to be the legendary Count of Saint Germain, in his work, The New Atlantis, describes a potential future civilization which lives on a land called Ben Salem. Following their work, the first race were known as the Polarians. These were beings composed entirely of etheric matter and had no physical bodies. They were some of the oldest beings to inhabit our planet and lived during the early stages of our world when it was still cooling on the legendary Mount Meru from Eastern mythologies. The second race lived in what is often called Hyperborea by the Greeks and Romans. In modern day, This is suggested to be the northern territories such as Greenland, Iceland, Canada, and Scandinavia. Due to their climate, this race developed different skin tones and a focus around surviving in the cold weather. The third and fourth races were the Lemurians and the Atlanteans that we have spoken about already. The fifth race were the Aryans. This was the current epoch that Blavatsky believed us to be in, which in her opinion were descended from and the result of the spread of Lemurians and Atlanteans after the sinking of their home. However, the concept of Aryans were distorted and diluted by Hitler and his whole Aryan race thing, but it's interesting nonetheless to visualize the history of the world in this way, almost as if descending from a higher frequency into this postmodern world we live in. We found all of this to be an interesting exploration of the history of humanity, and one that bridges quite well in the exploring of the epochs of time and the fall of Atlantis, bringing us to today. All of this really goes to show that these world religions are fundamentally connected with each other and a part of a much bigger story. Spiritual value can often be found in any faith if we look for it, and it's not appropriate to claim that only one religion or spirituality is specifically better or worse than another. Well, unless its core tenets are like, hurt others, take advantage of people, or kill people you don't like. Rather, today we simply must learn that we are all connected, all a part of the same family, and that we shouldn't demonize each other for our various beliefs, but hold a space of love and compassion for each other and what we believe, even if we disagree. Ultimately, this is a story about a young species who is struggling to find itself. We are learning the nature about who we are and recognizing that there might be a lot more to our origins than what we have been led to believe so far. And as fate would have it, there was an event that took place in history that dramatically changed the course of our history and shaped our world to be what it is today. If you want to continue this journey and explore more about Atlantis and other sacred sites, follow the link in the description and you can stream 2 full seasons of the Gaia original series, Ancient Civilizations, for free. See you next time.